Comfort women were women and girls who were forced into sexual slavery by the Imperial Japanese Army in occupied territories before and during World War II. The name, comfort women, is a translation of the Japanese ianfu, a euphemism for prostitute. Estimates vary as to how many women were involved, with numbers ranging from as low as 20,000 to as high as 360,000 to 410,000. The exact numbers are still being researched and debated. Many of the women were from occupied countries, including Korea, China, and the Philippines, although women from Burma, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Taiwan, Indonesia, East Timor, and other Japanese-occupied territories were used for military comfort stations. Stations were located in Japan, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, then Malaya, Thailand, Burma, New Guinea, Hong Kong, Macau, and French Indochina. A smaller number of women of European origin from the Netherlands and Australia were also involved. According to testimonies, young women from countries under Imperial Japanese rule were abducted from their homes. In many cases, women were also lured with promises of work in factories or restaurants. Once recruited, the women were incarcerated in comfort stations both in their nation and abroad. Establishment of the comfort women system. Japanese military prostitution. Military correspondence of the Japanese Imperial Army shows that the aim of facilitating comfort stations was the prevention of rape crimes committed by Japanese Army personnel and thus preventing the rise of hostility among people in occupied areas. Given the well-organized and open nature of prostitution in Japan, it was seen as logical that there should be organized prostitution to serve the Japanese armed forces. The Japanese Army established the comfort stations to prevent venereal diseases and rape by Japanese soldiers. To provide comfort to soldiers and head off espionage. The comfort stations were not actual solutions to the first two problems. However, according to Japanese historian Yoshiaki Yoshimi, they aggravated the problems. That is why it provided women. Outline. The first comfort station was established in the Japanese concession in Shanghai in 1932. Earlier comfort women were Japanese prostitutes who volunteered for such service. However, as Japan continued military expansion, the military found itself short of Japanese volunteers, and turned to the local population to coerce women into serving in these stations, or abducted them. Many women responded to calls for work as factory workers or nurses, and did not know that they were being pressed into sexual slavery. In the early stages of the war, Japanese authorities recruited prostitutes through conventional means. In urban areas, conventional advertising through middlemen was used alongside kidnapping. Middlemen advertised in newspapers circulating in Japan and the Japanese colonies of Korea, Taiwan, Manchukuo, and China. These sources soon dried up, especially from Japan. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs resisted further issuance of travel visas for Japanese prostitutes, feeling it tarnished the image of the Japanese Empire. The military turned to acquiring comfort women outside mainland Japan, especially from Korea and occupied China. Many women were tricked or defrauded into joining the military brothels. The Japanese forced Hui Muslim girls in China to serve as sex slaves by setting up the Hui Girls' School, and enrolling Hui girls into the school. For this purpose, the situation became worse as the war progressed. Under the strain of the war effort, the military became unable to provide enough supplies to Japanese units. In response, the units made up the difference by demanding or looting supplies from the locals. Along the front lines, especially in the countryside where middlemen were rare, the military often directly demanded that local leaders procure women for the brothels. When the locals, especially Chinese, were considered hostile, Japanese soldiers carried out the Three Ols policy, which included indiscriminately kidnapping and raping local civilians. In 1944, the United States Office of War Information report of interviews with 20 Korean comfort women in Burma found that the girls were induced by the offer of plenty of money, an opportunity to pay off family debts, easy work, and the prospect of a new life in a new land, Singapore. On the basis of these false representations, many girls enlisted for overseas duty and were rewarded with an advance of a few hundred yen. Only some of these girls who had paid their debt were allowed to return to Korea. Later archives on April 17, 2007, Yoshiaki Yoshimi and Hirofuma Hayashi announced the discovery, in the archives of the Tokyo trials, of 7 official documents suggesting that imperial military forces, such as the Tokaitai, forced women whose fathers attacked the Kenpitai to work in frontline brothels in China, Indochina and Indonesia. These documents were initially made public at the war crimes trial. In one of these, a lieutenant is quoted as confessing to having organized a brothel and having used it himself. Another source refers to Tokaitai members having arrested women on the streets, and after enforced medical examinations, putting them in brothels. On May 12, 2007, journalist Taichiro Kajimura announced the discovery of 30 Dutch government documents submitted to the Tokyo Tribunal as evidence of a forced mass prostitution incident in 1944 in Magelang. The South Korean government designated Bae Jeng-ya as a pro-Japanese collaborator in September 2007 for recruiting comfort women. In 2014, China produced almost 90 documents from the archives of the Kwantung Army on the issue. According to China, the documents provide ironclad proof that the Japanese military forced Asian women to work in frontline brothels before and during the Second World War. In June 2014, more official documents from the government of Japan's archives were made public, documenting sexual violence and women forced into sexual slavery committed by Imperial Japanese soldiers in French Indochina and Indonesia. A 2015 study examined archival data which was previously difficult to access, partly due to the China-Japan Joint Communique of 1972, in which the Chinese government agreed not to seek any restitution for wartime crimes and incidents. New documents discovered in China shed light on the facilities inside comfort stations operated within a Japanese army compound, and the conditions of the Korean comfort women. Documents were discovered verifying the Japanese army as the funding agency for purchasing at least some comfort women. Documents were found in Shanghai that showed in detail how the Japanese army went about opening comfort stations for Japanese troops in occupied Shanghai. Documents examined included the Tianjin Municipal Archives from the archival files of the Japanese government and the Japanese police during the periods of the occupation in World War II. Municipal archives from Shanghai and Nanjing were also examined. One conclusion reached was that the relevant archives in Korea are distorted. A conclusion of the study was that it is conceivable that the Japanese imperial government and the colonial government in Korea tried, as far as possible, to avoid revealing traces of the illegal mobilization of comfort women, and they burned most of the records immediately before the surrender, but the study confirmed that some documents and records have survived. Number of comfort women. Lack of official documentation has made estimates of the total number of comfort women difficult, as vast amounts of material pertaining to matters related to war crimes and the war responsibility of the nation's highest leaders were destroyed on the orders of the Japanese government at the end of the war. Historians have arrived at various estimates by looking at surviving documentation which indicate the ratio of the number of soldiers in a particular area to the number of women, as well as looking at replacement rates of the women. Historian Yoshiaki Yoshimi, who conducted the first academic study on the topic which brought the issue out into the open, estimated the number to be between 50,000 and 200,000. Based on these estimates, Most international media sources quote about 200,000 young women were kidnapped by Japanese soldiers to serve in Japanese military brothels. The BBC quotes 200,000 to 300,000, and the International Commission of Jurists quotes estimates of historians of 100,000 to 200,000 women. The Asahi Shimbun apologized in 2014 for stating the number of 200,000 Korean comfort women, which, on reconsideration, was regarded as inaccurate and the result of a conflation with an unrelated factory program. Country of origin. According to State University of New York at Buffalo professor Yoshiko Nozaki and other sources, the majority of the women were from Korea and China. Chuo University professor Yoshiaki Yoshimi states there were about 2,000 centers where as many as 200,000 Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Filipino, Taiwanese, Burmese, Indonesian, Dutch and Australian women were interned. Ikuhiko Hata, a professor of Nippon University, estimated the number of women working in the licensed pleasure quarter was fewer than 20,000 and that they were 40% Japanese, 20% Koreans, 10% Chinese, with others making up the remaining 30%. According to Hata, the total number of government-regulated prostitutes in Japan was only 170,000 during World War II. Others came from the Philippines, Taiwan, Dutch East Indies, and other Japanese-occupied countries and regions. Some Dutch women, captured in Dutch colonies in Asia, were also forced into sexual slavery. In further analysis of the Imperial Army medical records for venereal disease treatment from 1940, Yoshimi concluded that if the percentages of women treated reflected the general makeup of the total comfort women population, Korean women comprise 51.8%, Chinese 36% and Japanese 12.2%. A Dutch government study described how the Japanese military itself seized the women by force in the Dutch East Indies. It concluded that among the 200 to 300 European women found in the Japanese military brothels, some 65 were most certainly forced into prostitution. Others, faced with starvation in the refugee camps, agreed to offers of food and payment for work, the nature of which was not completely revealed to them. To date, only one Japanese woman has published her testimony. This was done in 1971, when a former comfort woman forced to work for Showa soldiers in Taiwan published her memoirs under the pseudonym of Suzuko Shirotha. Treatment of comfort women. Approximately three-quarters of comfort women died, and most survivors were left infertile due to sexual trauma or sexually transmitted diseases. Beatings and physical torture were said to be common. They were systematically beaten and raped day and night. As a victim of the incident, in 1990, Jan Rafo-Hearn testified to a U.S. House of Representatives committee. Many stories have been told about the horrors, brutalities, suffering and starvation of Dutch women in Japanese prison camps. But one story was never told, the most shameful story of the worst human rights abuse committed by the Japanese during World War II. The story of the comfort women, the Jugunian few, and how these women were forcibly seized against their will, to provide sexual services for the Japanese Imperial Army. In the comfort station, I was systematically beaten and raped day and night. Even the Japanese doctor raped me each time he visited the brothel to examine us for venereal disease. In their first morning at the brothel, photographs of Rafo-Hearn and the others were taken and placed on the veranda, which was used as a reception area for the Japanese personnel who would choose from these photographs. Over the following 4 months the girls were raped and beaten day and night, with those who became pregnant forced to have abortions. After 4 harrowing months, the girls were moved to a camp at Bogor, in West Java, where they were reunited with their families. This camp was exclusively for women who had been put into military brothels. and the Japanese warned the inmates that if anyone told what had happened to them, they and their family members would be killed. Several months later, the Oherns were transferred to a camp at Batavia, which was liberated on August 15, 1945. The Japanese officers involved received some punishment by Japanese authorities at the end of the war. After the end of the war, 11 Japanese officers were found guilty, with one soldier being sentenced to death by the Batavia War Criminal Court. The court decision found that the charge violated was the Army's order to hire only voluntary women. Victims from East Timor testified they were forced into slavery even when they were not old enough to have started menstruating. Hank Nelson, emeritus professor at the Australian National University's Asia-Pacific Research Division, has written about the brothels run by the Japanese military in Rabaul, Papua New Guinea during World War II. He quotes from the diary of Gordon Thomas, a POW in Rabaul. Thomas writes that the women working at the brothels most likely served 25 to 35 men a day, and that they were victims of the yellow slave trade. Nelson also quotes from Kentaro Igusa, a Japanese naval surgeon who was stationed in Rabaul.